A rust-covered Aston Martin sat abandoned behind a bankrupt repair shop on the edge of an industrial district that smelled of old motor oil and broken ambition. Someone had taped a handwritten sign to the cracked windshield black marker on cardboard, the letters thick and final. Dead, engine scrap only. The broker who managed the liquidation sale had already apologized twice to the handful of collectors who had bothered to show up, explaining that the car was beyond saving, that its value now existed purely in the weight of its remaining steel. The collectors looked, shrugged, and walked away. Then Marcus Hale stepped forward, and the atmosphere shifted not because anyone respected him, but because everyone recognized him. And recognition in that world carried its own particular cruelty. Marcus was the janitor, not metaphorically, not a man who had briefly fallen from grace and was working his way back. He was the janitor at Crown Velocity Motors, one of the most prestigious luxury automotive groups in the country. A man whose face most of the executives he served could not have picked out of a lineup. He was 45 years old, quiet in the way that some men grow quiet after carrying something heavy for too long, and he was holding a plain white envelope that contained every dollar he had managed to save over the course of 3 careful years. The broker looked at the envelope. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the envelope again. The transaction took less than 4 minutes. $1,000 changed hands, and the Aston Martin, or what remained of it, belonged to a janitor. Word moved fast at industry events. It always did. By the time the small crowd had drifted toward the parking lot, the story had already taken on the shape of a joke being passed between people who considered themselves too important to laugh out loud. They laughed anyway. And at the center of that laughter, elegant and unhurried, stood Vanessa Crowe. She was 32 years old and carried herself with the kind of confidence that is not born but constructed assembled piece by piece from a decade of deliberate choices, each one designed to put distance between herself and anyone she considered beneath her trajectory. As director of brand strategy at Crown Velocity Motors, she had spent years crafting the image of luxury, and she wore that image as naturally as her tailored charcoal coat. She had a way of looking at people that communicated, without any single identifiable component, that she had already assessed them and found the assessment unremarkable. She looked at Marcus the way someone looks at a curiosity they have no intention of examining closely, and then she said it loud enough to be heard, precise enough to be remembered. "You just bought yourself a coffin on wheels." A beat of silence. Then the laughter came properly, fully, without restraint. Marcus did not respond. He simply turned back to the car, leaned down, and looked into the engine compartment with the stillness of a man who is reading something no one else in the room can see. When he finally spoke, it was quietly, almost to himself. "No," he said. "They just don't understand it yet." Vanessa's smile did not change. She filed the comment away the way she filed most things from people she had dismissed efficiently, in a folder she would never open again. She was wrong about the filing. She would open it many times in the months that followed, and each time the contents would look different than they had before. Marcus Hale lived alone in a rented garage on the south side of the city, the kind of space that real estate listings would describe as a live-work unit but which was really just a garage with a cot, a hot plate, and enough shelving to hold the organized interior life of a man who had learned to compress himself into whatever space the world was willing to offer. He ate, simply. He slept 6 hours. He worked 6 days a week at Crown Velocity Motors, arriving before anyone else, leaving after most had gone, moving through the building's corridors, with the practiced invisibility of someone who has long since stopped expecting to be seen. The other staff liked him in the abstract way that people like furniture, appreciating its presence, never thinking much about it. His supervisor had once described him, in a performance review Marcus was never meant to read, as reliable and unremarkable. Marcus had read it anyway. He had filed it carefully in a folder and moved on. What his supervisor did not know, what almost no one at Crown Velocity Motors knew, was that Marcus Hale could read a technical schematic the way a concert pianist reads sheet music fluently, intuitively, with an almost physical pleasure in the precision of the notation. He kept technical manuals stacked along one wall of the garage. Classic Aston Martin engineering guides, mid-century British motor engineering texts, hand-annotated documents about hybrid powertrain theory from the early experimental period. He had acquired them over years, carefully, the way a scholar acquires primary sources not for decoration but for use. He had not always lived this way. There had been a different version of his life, running parallel to this one in memory, like a road he could see from a distance, but could no longer drive a house in a quiet neighborhood. A marriage to a woman named Claire, who had loved him with the specific patience of someone committed to a person rather than their circumstances. A daughter named Elena, who was now 15, and lived with her mother in another state, and called him on holidays with the careful politeness of a child who has learned that her relationship with her father is something to be managed rather than simply felt. He sent money every month. He sent birthday cards with specific, honest notes in them, rather than the generic warmth of a man performing affection at a distance. Whether any of it was enough he genuinely did not know, and he had learned not to torture himself with the uncertainty, because uncertainty of that kind, if you let it, will consume every hour you have. He spent those hours differently. He read. He worked. He studied. He brought to the work of being a janitor the same thoroughness he brought to everything, which meant that the corridors and workspaces he maintained at Crown Velocity Motors were consistently in better condition than the facilities team expected, a fact that his supervisor noted occasionally, and that his supervisor's superiors never thought about at all. He was a ghost in the building. He preferred it. The night he brought the broken Aston Martin home on a borrowed trailer, he circled it for a long time before touching it. The car in the yard looked defeated in the way that only machines can look defeated, not with despair but with a kind of suspension, as if waiting for a state that has not yet arrived. He put on a work light, pulled on gloves, and began. At Crown Velocity Motors, Vanessa Crowe was already halfway through the story of the janitor and the dead car, deploying it at a quarterly strategy dinner, with the practiced timing of someone who understands that the right anecdote at the right moment is a form of social currency. The executives laughed. She smiled the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, because it is not intended to, it is intended only to be noticed. She had joined Crown Velocity Motors 8 years ago as a junior strategist, and had moved upward with a velocity that she herself would have called earned, and that others, more quietly, called something else. She wanted the CEO position. She was not subtle about it to herself, though she was careful about how she expressed it to others. She had a talent for making ambition look like dedication, which is one of the more useful skills available to someone who intends to win. The story of Marcus and the Aston Martin was a minor entertainment, a footnote. She gave it no further thought. And then, 2 days later, one of her junior analysts mentioned that Marcus had been seen accessing the company's archived digital records late on a Tuesday evening. Vanessa set down her coffee. Her expression did not change, but something behind it did. The company archives were not technically off-limits to general staff. They were simply not the kind of place that general staff ever went, which, in a corporate environment, amounts to nearly the same thing. Marcus had gone in with a keycard that granted him cleaning access. He was authorized to be in the building, simply not in that particular corridor for that particular purpose. He had stayed for 40 minutes. He had looked at files from a project designated internally as Meridian. Vanessa knew about Meridian. She knew about it in the specific, weighted way that a person knows about something they have actively chosen not to think about, a knowledge held at arm's length, stored in a part of the mind kept deliberately dim. Meridian had been a prototype program, 10 years ago, an ultra-high-performance experimental vehicle, built in secret collaboration between Crown Velocity's engineering division and a European propulsion partner. The project had lasted 2 years before it ended abruptly, following a catastrophic test failure that the company's official account described as a mechanical anomaly. One engineer had died. The program was buried. The prototype was supposed to have been destroyed. Vanessa had been a junior associate at a consulting firm contracted to the company at the time. She had seen more than she was supposed to see. She had made a choice about what to do with that knowledge, and the choice had served her well in the years since. She hired a private investigator within 24 hours of learning that Marcus had accessed the Meridian files. The investigator came back to her 3 days later with a name. Not just Marcus Hale, the janitor. Marcus Hale, formerly senior propulsion engineer. Project Meridian listed in the internal records as the primary architect of the prototype's core drive system. Listed also, in a separate document, as the individual held responsible for the test failure. Vanessa sat with that information for a long time. When she stood up, she moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided that a minor problem is actually a significant one. In the garage on the south side of the city, Marcus was working by the light of 2 industrial lamps and the small glow of a laptop screen. He had removed the engine block completely and laid it on a work table. And what he found beneath the layers of corrosion and deliberate damage, because some of it, he could now see clearly, was deliberate, was something that should not have existed in a car showing up at a bankruptcy liquidation sale. Deliberate damage has a different signature than neglect. Neglect is random, an accumulation of entropy without direction. Deliberate damage is purposeful. It has intention behind it. And intention leaves traces for someone who knows what to look for. Marcus knew what to look for. He had spent 20 years learning to read the language of machines, and what the engine told him, once he had removed the outermost layers, was that someone had worked carefully to make it look like something it was not. The outer components had been replaced with standard production parts. The identifying markings had been ground off several surfaces. The onboard data module had been physically altered in a way designed to prevent retrieval. Whoever had prepared this car for disposal had done a thorough job, but they had not known about the secondary assembly, which was concealed behind a bracket that did not appear in any standard schematic. In a space that only existed in the prototype design, and which Marcus himself had specified as the location for a component he had always described in his notes simply as the core. Beneath the outer components, beneath the parts that corresponded to the standard production documentation, there was a secondary assembly. It was small, elegant, machined with a precision that dated it unmistakably to the experimental period. It bore a marking stamped into the metal in a typeface he recognized immediately because he had chosen it himself. A small, stylized M. The internal designation code for Project Meridian. This was not a salvaged Aston Martin. This was the prototype. Or rather, this was one of the prototypes, because there had been 2. And only one had been destroyed. The second had been ordered destroyed and had somehow, through a chain of events Marcus could only begin to reconstruct, ended up sitting behind a bankrupt repair shop with a cardboard sign on the windshield and a $1,000 price tag. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Then he opened a new document on his laptop and began to write down everything he remembered. What Marcus remembered was this: the prototype had worked. Not just worked, it had performed at a level that made the engineering team's hands shake when they reviewed the data. The drive system he had designed delivered output figures that the company's own benchmarks had declared theoretically impossible for a vehicle in that weight class. The team had celebrated quietly, the way engineers celebrate with coffee and spreadsheets, and a collective reluctance to speak too loudly in case the numbers disappeared. The propulsion architecture he had developed was unlike anything in production at the time. It borrowed from aerospace thermal management principles and applied them to a ground vehicle in a way that had been theorized in academic literature but never successfully executed. The fuel efficiency gains alone were significant enough that, had the project proceeded to market, they would have required competitors to fundamentally reconsider their own development roadmaps. The vehicle was not simply fast. It was a different kind of answer to a question the industry had been asking for years. The team understood what they had. That understanding, Marcus would eventually realize, was precisely the problem. The companies whose current product lines would have been made to look inadequate by the prototype's performance had been watching. The financial architecture of the luxury automotive world is built on the assumption that the definition of excellence belongs to whoever currently holds the highest position, and a small experimental program, run by a mid-sized player in an industrial garage, does not get to rewrite that definition without consequences. And then the test failure had happened. Marcus had been in a different building when it occurred. The logs showed that clearly. But the logs that the company submitted to the investigation board had been altered. He had known this at the time, had said so, had presented his own data in evidence. It had not mattered. The board's conclusion had been handed down within a week. Engineer error. Primary responsibility assigned to Marcus Hale. He had lost his engineering license. He had lost his professional standing. His marriage, which had already been under strain from the years of intensive work, did not survive the collapse that followed. He had spent the next several years rebuilding himself from the bottom, which in practice meant descending without complaint to whatever work was available while quietly, privately, methodically, preparing for the moment when he might have something to say again. He had not known what that moment would look like. He was beginning to understand it now. He photographed every component of the Meridian assembly. He cataloged everything. And then he began, with great care, to bring the engine back to life. The sound happened on a Thursday night at 11:47, and it was not a subtle sound. The Aston Martin's engine turned over with a deep, rolling thunder that had no business coming from a vehicle that had been declared mechanically dead, and the noise traveled out of the garage and down the street and into the awareness of a young man named Derek Calloway, who filmed cars for a living, and who happened to be walking past because he lived 2 blocks away and had not yet learned to take a different route home. He heard the sound and stopped walking. He stood still for a moment, the way animals go still when they sense something that falls outside their ordinary experience. Then he took out his phone and walked toward it. The garage door was up 6 inches for ventilation. He crouched down and filmed for 90 seconds. The clip went online the following morning with the title, "Janitor Revives Dead Aston Martin, Listen to That Engine." By evening it had been viewed 240,000 times. By the following morning, it had passed 1 million. The automotive enthusiast community is a specific and passionate subculture, and within that community, the clip landed like a stone in still water. The ripples moved fast and far. Forums lit up, channels dedicated analysis videos to the sound of the engine, which several independent engineers confirmed. Even from the low-quality phone recording, exhibited acoustic signatures inconsistent with any standard production Aston Martin powertrain. One retired powertrain engineer, watching the clip in his living room in Michigan, said aloud to no one in particular, "That is not a production engine." He said it the way you say something when the evidence is too clear for discretion. He posted his analysis within the hour. It was shared 4,000 times before midnight. Something unusual was running in that garage, and the automotive world, which has a long memory for vehicles that should not exist, began paying close attention. At Crown Velocity Motors, Vanessa learned about the video from a junior communications staff member who had flagged it in the morning briefing with the instinct correct, as it turned out that someone higher up would want to know. Vanessa watched the clip 3 times. Her face remained composed throughout. When she was alone, she placed a call to the company's legal department and then to the company's head of acquisitions. Within 48 hours, a representative arrived at Marcus's garage with an offer. $250,000 for the vehicle. Unconditional. No questions asked. Marcus was in the middle of calibrating a fuel delivery component when the man arrived. He listened to the offer without stopping what he was doing. Then he set down his tools, wiped his hands on a cloth, and looked at the representative directly for the first time. "You don't want the car," he said. "You want what it proves." The representative left without the vehicle. That same evening, Marcus received a message from a man named Raymond Stills, a name he had not heard in 10 years. Raymond had been a junior engineer on Project Meridian 2, junior to be implicated in the aftermath, senior enough to have understood what was actually happening. The message was short. It said, "If you make that car run completely, they will try to silence you." Marcus read it twice. Then he wrote back, "I know. Keep going anyway." The story of who Marcus Hale actually was reached the automotive press in fragments. The way these things always do, a detail here, a connection there, a former colleague who agreed to speak on background, a public record that someone thought to search. Within a week of the viral video, 2 independent journalists had separately identified Marcus as the former Meridian engineer. The framing in most early coverage was cautious, uncertain, hedged with qualifications, but the interest was intense, because the story had the particular shape that generates sustained attention. A man declared responsible for a disaster, stripped of everything, living in a garage, and now, a decade later, holding what appeared to be physical proof that the disaster had been engineered, not by his incompetence, but by someone else's calculation. Vanessa's response came in multiple waves. The company's communications team released a statement describing Marcus as a disgruntled former contractor with a history of making unfounded allegations. A media outlet with known ties to the luxury automotive sector published a profile under the headline, "The Obsessed Mechanic: How a Fired Engineer's Decade-Long Grudge Became a Viral Fantasy." The language was precise, in the way that character-destroying language is always precise. Not accusing him of lying directly, but assembling enough qualifying phrases around his credibility that a casual reader would come away uncertain. The profile mentioned his divorce. It mentioned the decade of manual labor. It used the word obsessed in 3 different configurations across 700 words, which is a technique so old it has a name in media criticism but continues to work because most readers do not study media criticism. There was also a legal letter, 12 pages of language from Crown Velocity's outside counsel, that translated approximately to, "Stop, or we will make this expensive." Marcus read the letter carefully. He showed it to Raymond Stills, who by this point was communicating through encrypted channels with the methodical caution of a man who has spent a decade waiting for the right moment to no longer be silent. Raymond suggested a lawyer. Marcus called her. She read the letter and said it was standard intimidation and that he should continue exactly as he was. The automotive community largely rejected the corporate framing. Independent engineers who had seen footage of the prototype's components posted detailed analyses confirming that the assembly Marcus had uncovered was consistent with the Meridian program's known technical specifications. The conversation grew louder. Vanessa grew quieter, in a way that the people around her had learned to recognize as the silence before escalation. One morning, Marcus arrived at the garage to find the door lock forced and the interior searched. Whoever had come had been professional about it. Nothing was obviously destroyed. Nothing had been taken that Marcus could immediately identify. But the filing cabinet had been gone through, and the laptop he kept on the workbench had been moved 2 inches from where he always placed it. He stood in the doorway and looked at the space for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and called Raymond Stills. The conversation was brief. By the following night, the Aston Martin was gone from the garage on the south side of the city, relocated to a space that Marcus had arranged 2 weeks earlier, at the recommendation of a retired automotive restoration expert named George Whitfield, who had followed the story and offered his workshop a large, secure facility on the edge of a rural county, with no external signage and a gate that required both a code and a physical key. Marcus worked in the new location with focused intensity for 6 weeks, occasionally joined by George, who had the particular competence of a man who has worked with his hands for 50 years and wastes no motion. The car came together in stages, each stage documented with photographs and detailed written logs that Marcus stored in 3 separate encrypted locations. The exterior, carefully restored to the original prototype livery, a deep, almost black midnight blue, emerged from weeks of panel work as something quietly stunning. The mechanical systems, rebuilt around the original Meridian drive assembly, were tested incrementally, each test recorded. When Marcus finally drove the car out of George's workshop for the first time, fully operational, he sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, and in the silence before the sound came, his expression held something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but existed in the space between them. George stood in the workshop doorway with his arms folded and watched and said nothing, which was the correct response and the reason Marcus had trusted him from the beginning. The week before the exhibition, Marcus drove the completed car for the first time, on an open road, not a test run but a proper drive, 40 miles through a stretch of empty rural highway that George had recommended for exactly this purpose. The car performed as he had always known it would. The Meridian drive system, rebuilt component by component over months, delivered everything the original data had promised. Sitting behind the wheel, feeling the road through the chassis, with the particular sensitivity that distinguishes a well-engineered vehicle from everything else, Marcus understood for the first time in a decade what it felt like to be in the presence of something he had made. He had made other things since had maintained buildings, had kept machines operational with the competence of a man who understands that the work you are given is not always the work that defines you, but it is still work, and it is still yours. But this was different. This was the thing itself, the work that had been taken from him and had come back. He drove it for the full 40 miles without stopping. And when he turned around and drove the 40 miles back, he was not thinking about the exhibition or the journalists or the documents in the case on the back seat. He was thinking about combustion and torque and the physics of a machine designed to do one thing extraordinarily well. When he pulled back into George's yard, George was standing by the gate with 2 cups of coffee, and he handed one to Marcus without a word. The International Luxury and Performance Automotive Exhibition was held that year in a convention center large enough to land a commercial aircraft inside, its floor covered in the kind of carpet that exists only in spaces where money is performing its own particular theater. The manufacturers displayed their current production models under carefully engineered lighting. The press attended in force. The industry's executives moved through the space with the collective confidence of people who own the definition of excellence and are generous enough to share it with the public for 3 days at a registered ticket price. Marcus arrived on the second day driving the Aston Martin. He had registered as an independent exhibitor, a category that existed largely to accommodate wealthy collectors and restoration enthusiasts, and that therefore attracted minimal scrutiny from the organizing committee, who could not have imagined what they were approving. He drove into the exhibition hall through the vehicle entrance, and the sound of the engine unmuffled by walls, filling the concrete corridor with a resonance that stopped conversations 50 meters away, announced his arrival before anyone saw the car. When the Aston Martin came into view, there was a moment of collective incomprehension. People recognized the shape, the classic profile of a vehicle from that era, but the livery was wrong for any production model, and the sound was wrong for anything they knew. And then someone in the crowd who had been following the story for weeks said the name aloud, Meridian, and the moment changed. Vanessa was at the exhibition. She was standing near the Crown Velocity Motors display, which occupied a prestigious corner of the main floor, talking to a representative from a European investment group. When she heard the engine, and then heard the word ripple through the crowd, she turned. She saw the midnight blue car moving through the hall. She saw Marcus Hale behind the wheel. For the first time in 10 years since the morning the investigation board had delivered its verdict, and she had sat in the third row of a conference room and said nothing. She felt something she had not allowed herself to feel, the specific vertigo of a person standing at the edge of a consequence they have been successfully avoiding. Marcus stopped the car in the center of the main exhibition floor. He got out. From the back seat, he retrieved a case. Inside the case were documents, printed files, labeled drives, an audio recording on a physical device, a chain of evidence assembled over months, some of it reconstructed from memory and public records, some of it recovered from the Meridian prototype's own onboard data storage, which had been intact and readable beneath the layers of deliberate modification designed to conceal it. He set the case on the car's hood, and he opened it, and he began to speak. His voice was quiet. In the convention hall's acoustics, it carried. He explained what Project Meridian had been. He explained what it had achieved. He explained what had happened to the test vehicle, and how, and why, and by whose decision the fault had been redirected onto his professional record. He named names. He presented the data. He let the documents speak in the way that documents, when they are real and complete, speak more powerfully than any voice. Vanessa moved through the crowd toward him. She reached him as he was finishing. The cameras were everywhere, press cameras, phone cameras. The constant documentation of an industry event that had just become something else entirely. She spoke to him in a low voice, tightly controlled, the elegance still in place, like a structure that has taken damage but has not yet collapsed. She told him that this was a mistake, that there were legal remedies available to the company, that he was exposing himself to significant personal liability. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He said, "I know what exposure feels like." He turned back to the journalists who had gathered, and he answered their questions. The press corps worked fast. By that afternoon, the story was on the front pages of every major automotive and business publication. By evening, the documents Marcus had presented were being analyzed by independent technical experts and former regulatory officials. The audio recording a conversation from 10 years earlier, conducted in a conference room that Marcus had entered, with his own keycard, and which he had recorded on a small device, clipped to the inside of his jacket, contained the discussion that had determined how the investigation's blame would be assigned. The voices were identifiable. The language was explicit. By the following morning, Crown Velocity Motors stock had fallen 19%. Within the week, the company's board of directors convened an emergency session. Vanessa Crowe was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review that everyone in the industry understood was not an internal review, but a conclusion preceded by its own paperwork. The collapse of a corporate narrative, once it begins, moves with the logic of a structure that has been load-bearing on a false foundation, not gradually but suddenly, and then all at once. Former employees of Crown Velocity Motors, some of whom had stayed silent for years out of contractual obligation, and some out of simpler fear, began to speak. Two former members of the original Meridian Investigation Board gave statements to a journalist from a major financial publication, confirming that the process had been directed from above. A former technical director, retired for 3 years and no longer constrained by any active agreement, provided documentation showing that the company had received internal warnings about the prototype's testing conditions and had proceeded anyway. The regulatory agency that had closed the original investigation announced that it was reopening the case. Industry analysts began recalculating the cost projections not only for Crown Velocity Motors but for the broader sector, because the safety standard failures that the Meridian documents exposed had implications that reached beyond a single company. The engineers and executives who had signed off on the original test parameters were identified by name in the regulatory filing. Some of them were still working in the industry. Some of them had risen to senior positions. The reckoning was neither quick nor painless, and it was far larger than Vanessa Crowe, though she was its most visible embodiment. Within 6 months of the exhibition, 3 separate regulatory reviews had been launched across 2 countries. The safety certification process for high-performance prototype vehicles was redesigned from its foundations. Engineering, licensing boards issued new guidance on whistleblower protections for technical staff. None of this happened neatly, and none of it happened without resistance. Because industries do not reform themselves out of principle, they reform under pressure and then learn, slowly, to call the result a principle. But it happened. The Meridian documents, released into the public domain by Marcus, as he had promised, became a standard reference point in the academic and regulatory conversation about automotive safety culture. They were cited in 3 separate published studies within the first year. A professor at a technical university in the Midwest built an entire seminar around them, inviting Marcus to speak once, which he did, in his usual style, quietly, without performance, answering questions with the precision of a man who is still, at his core, an engineer thinking through a problem. Vanessa did not go quietly, because people like Vanessa do not go quietly. They go loudly and strategically, attempting even in retreat to maintain control of the narrative. Her lawyers sent letters. Her communications team, working now without institutional resources but still with professional competence, attempted several counterframings. In one session with a journalist she had trusted historically to be sympathetic, she said something that the journalist published verbatim and which stayed. This industry does not reward the people who are right. It rewards the people who win. The statement was intended, perhaps, as a kind of defiant honesty. It was received as a confession. She was removed from the Crown Velocity Motors board before the month was out. And the social architecture she had spent a decade building, the dinners, the relationships, the carefully maintained network of people who owed her something or feared her enough to be useful, began to dissolve with the speed that social architectures always dissolve when the power that held them together is visibly gone. Marcus was in George Whitfield's workshop the day the full extent of the board's decision became public, and he heard the news on the radio the way he received most news, quietly, without performance, absorbing it with the same stillness he brought to everything. He was in the middle of reassembling a carburetor, and he continued doing that after the news finished because the carburetor required his attention and the news did not require anything from him anymore. A reporter reached him by phone that afternoon and asked the question that reporters always ask in these moments, the question that carries within it an expectation of a particular kind of answer. "Did you do this for revenge?" Marcus thought about it. Not long, but genuinely. Which the reporter could hear in the pause. "No," he said. "I did it because the engine was still good. It just needed someone to turn the key." He meant the literal engine, but he was also, without trying to be, talking about something larger, and the reporter was experienced enough to understand that he did not need to clarify, and that any attempt to do so would reduce, rather than expand, what he had said. She published the quote without further context. It was the most reprinted sentence from any interview that week. There was a larger press conference 2 weeks later, organized not by Marcus but by the attorneys who had taken his case on contingency after the documents became public. Marcus sat at the table and answered questions for 2 hours. He was precise and factual, and occasionally, when asked about the specific human cost of what had been done to him, the career, the marriage, the decade of invisibility, he paused and looked at his hands, and then looked up and spoke without bitterness, which the journalists in the room found more affecting than bitterness would have been. A reporter from a television network asked him, toward the end, what he wanted people to understand. He said, that some things don't die. They just wait for someone who hasn't given up on them. Someone offered him $6 million for the Aston Martin before the press conference had finished. He declined. Not dramatically, not with a speech, he simply said no, and moved on to the next question, with the calm of a man who has known for some time exactly what the car is worth to him, and understands that the figure is not monetary. The offers continued for months afterward. A private collector in Europe made a formal written proposal. A technology company, one of the newer entrants into the electric vehicle market, expressed interest in acquiring the Meridian drive system for research purposes and offered a figure so substantial that Marcus's attorney felt obligated to present it in person and wait for a response before leaving the room. Marcus's response was the same each time. The car was not for sale. The technology, he explained, would be published, the full technical specifications released into the public domain, available to any engineer anywhere who wanted to build on the work. That decision cost him a figure his attorney tried several times to make him fully appreciate. Marcus appreciated it. He released the documents anyway. In the months that followed, Marcus Hale became something that he had never sought to become, and handled with the same quietness he brought to everything else. A known figure, the automotive press wrote about him at length. Engineering schools invited him to speak, and he accepted some of those invitations and declined others based on criteria that he never publicly explained, but that his audiences, if they paid attention, could work out. He went where he thought something real might be communicated and stayed away from events where his story would be converted into entertainment without substance. He used a portion of the settlement that Crown Velocity Motors reached with him, a figure undisclosed by agreement, but sufficient to secure a proper facility. Not large, a working garage with good lighting and adequate space, in a neighborhood that did not require a lengthy explanation. He put a sign above the door that said simply, Hale Restoration. He did not advertise. Within the first month, he had more inquiries than he could handle, mostly from serious collectors with serious cars who had heard the story and understood that the man who had brought the Meridian prototype back to life knew something about engines that most people working in the industry had never been taught. He hired 2 young engineers, both recent graduates, one of whom had written her thesis on experimental hybrid powertrain development and had cited the Meridian program as a case study in suppressed innovation. She arrived for her interview with a detailed technical analysis of the original prototype specifications, reconstructed from the documents Marcus had made public, and she placed it on his workbench without ceremony and waited. He read it carefully. Then he asked her 3 questions about her methodology, and her answers were good. He hired her the same day. The other engineer was quieter and had hands that moved with the particular precision of someone who had grown up working on machines before he was formally trained to do so. Marcus recognized the quality immediately because he had been the same kind of young man. They were a small team. They worked on interesting problems and turned away work that did not interest them, which is the privilege available to people who no longer need to be invisible. George Whitfield came by occasionally, retired but unable to fully leave the proximity of a workshop where something worth watching was being done, and Marcus would make coffee, and they would sit and talk about engines with the comfortable depth of 2 men who share a language that most people around them do not speak. Elena called in the spring, and the call was different from the holiday calls. She did not use the careful, managed politeness of before. She had followed the story. She said had followed it from the beginning, though she had not told him. She had watched the exhibition footage. She had read the press coverage. She had sat with her mother and watched the press conference on a laptop in their kitchen, and her mother had not said anything but had put her hand briefly over Elena's and left it there. Elena asked him if he was okay. He said he was. She asked if she could come visit the workshop sometime and see the car. He said yes, any time, and meant it more completely than he had meant most things. When she came, 3 weeks later, She stood in front of the Aston Martin for a long time without speaking, in the way that people stand before things that have held meaning for others and are trying to feel the weight of it for themselves. Then she looked at Marcus and said, "It's beautiful," he said. "It was always beautiful. It just needed to be found." She stayed for the weekend and helped with a minor restoration project on a 1958 Roadster, following his instructions with a focused competence that surprised him and then, on reflection, did not surprise him at all. She was his daughter. Some things are carried forward in ways that do not require proximity to transmit. The Aston Martin lived in the workshop. Not displayed, not under glass. Not on a platform, simply present. Parked in its space, the way a working car is parked. Available to be driven. Marcus drove it occasionally, on weekday evenings when the city traffic had thinned, taking it onto the highway that curved along the waterfront and opening the engine up enough to hear it properly. On one of those evenings, he drove it to the coast at dawn. He had been awake since 4, thinking about a problem in a restoration project. He was working on a 1962 British Roadster with a compromised frame that required a solution he had not yet fully articulated. And when he could not sleep anymore, he got up and drove. The road along the cliffs was empty at that hour. The sky was doing the thing it does in the last minutes before sunrise, when the light is not yet light but the darkness has already begun to release its claim, and the water below the cliffs held a silver that had no name in any color chart he knew. The engine's sound traveled out over the water and came back slightly transformed, as sounds do when they cross open space. And Marcus drove with one hand on the wheel and his window down despite the cold, and the air tasted like salt and distance. He thought about the 10 years. Not with the rehearsed bitterness he had disciplined himself out of long ago, but with the kind of clear-eyed accounting that is available only to someone who has come through to the other side of something and can look back at the whole of it without the distortion of being inside it. The years had cost him things that could not be returned. That was simply true, and he had made his peace with it not by diminishing the loss, but by refusing to let the loss be the largest thing in the frame. There had also been, in those years, a particular kind of learning, available only to a man stripped of the comfortable assumptions of professional status, a return to fundamentals, to the actual texture of physical work, and to the knowledge that competence is its own reality and does not require an institution to validate it. He had learned, in those years, how to exist inside invisibility without being diminished by it. He had learned the difference between patience and surrender, which is a distinction that looks obvious from the outside, but which, when you are living inside a decade of being no one, requires daily maintenance to keep clear. He had learned that a man can know something to be true and carry that knowledge without needing the world to confirm it, which is either a form of strength or a form of stubbornness, and is most likely both. He thought about Claire and the house, and Elena, at age 5, sitting on the hood of a car in a parking lot somewhere, while he explained to her, with the earnest over-detail of a parent who loves what they know, how an internal combustion engine turns heat into motion. Elena had listened with the serious attention of a 5-year-old who has decided to take an interest, and then she had asked, "But where does the fire go?" He had not had a perfect answer. He still did not. Some questions stay open, and that is not a failure of the question or the person asking it. It is simply what some questions do. The engine ran beautifully beneath him. It had always been a good engine. He had known that from the first moment he had put his hands on it in the salvage yard, had felt it in the way you feel certain things that cannot be fully explained, a recognition that precedes analysis. They had tried to bury it. They had tried to discredit the man who built it. They had succeeded for 10 years, which was longer than they should have but shorter than they had planned. The sun came over the horizon in the particular way it comes in the last week of autumn. Low and direct, and without the softening of summer haze, and the light hit the midnight blue hood of the Aston Martin and moved along the curves of the body, and Marcus watched it in his peripheral vision without turning his head, keeping his eyes on the road. Behind him, the city was waking up. Somewhere in it, a young engineer was probably already in the workshop, her coffee untouched, bent over something that she had decided needed her full attention before anyone else arrived. He would be back by 8. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And the work, he had come to understand, was not separate from the rest of it. It was not a refuge from the difficulty of having lived. but the proof that he had lived, that his hands still knew what they knew, that some things persist through whatever is thrown at them and come out the other side intact, changed in detail, but unchanged in essence, ready to run. He let the engine speak in the early morning silence and drove on. And the car held the road, the way it had always been designed to hold it. Perfectly, completely, as if the decade of darkness had been simply a long pause between one moment of motion and the next. Some machines do not die. They only wait for the right person to come back for them.